Hello.
Hi there.
Uh, okay,
Yeah,
so I'm Julia. I will be assisting you in this webinar. And before we start, I would like to introduce you a little bit ahead. So I think we can start now.
that sounds great.
So first of all, I would like to welcome everyone and say hello. So welcome to today's webinar and the power of nonviolent struggle lessons from the global movements. First of all, introducing myself as Julia. I'll be responsible for hosting this webinar today, and thank you all for being with us on this webinar. Now it's my honor to introduce our special guest, Jamila Raqib, a specialist in the study and practice of strategic nonviolent action and the executive director of the Albert Einstein Institution, which works to advance the research and application of nonviolent action worldwide. For more than 15 years, she worked closely with the late Dr. Jean Sharp, the world's foremost scholar of the field of strategic nonviolent action. Since 2002, she has been focusing on the development and distribution of educational resources on nonviolent action and has conducted workshops on strategic planning for human rights organizations, universities, and governmental bodies, and for individuals and groups struggling for diverse objectives, including to oppose dictatorship and combat corruption and to attain political rights, economic justice, environmental protection, and women's empowerment. So, along with her experiences, today she will discuss Myanmar's current political struggles by comparing with international context. And this talk will last about 1.5 hours, and there will be a question and answer session at the end. So we would appreciate if you hold your questions till the discussion time. For your information, a recorded version of this webinar will also be available on YouTube as soon as possible. So as the time comes to start our webinar, I'm glad to welcome you again, Jamila, to discuss today's topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia. Hello, everyone. Good evening. And thank you so much for being here today for this lecture and what I hope is also going to be an exchange of ideas on nonviolent action, a topic that is of great importance to all of our societies around the world, but especially for Myanmar, a country that has had a long history of the use of this type of action in its struggle for democracy and human rights. I look forward to our time together. So I am going to just share my screen here. I have a couple of slides for part of the presentation. Okay, great. So as Julia mentioned, I work at an organization called the Albert Einstein Institution in Boston in the United States. And I worked there for more than 20 years. And the focus of our work is to study nonviolent action in order to understand how this type of action works, what makes it succeed and what makes it fail, and then to take that information and share it with people, who could make use of it, whether through books, with trainings or workshops and other educational gatherings, and also more recently to create multimedia material so that they could use that and incorporate that into their own trainings. So these are some of our books. This is a Norwegian translation of From Dictatorship to Democracy on the right side of the screen, as well as a Thai translation of a book called The Anti-Coup that you may be familiar with. So we look at this type of action as an important and also complex technique, one that requires, yes, of course, bravery and persistence, but that also has other requirements for effectiveness, skills and understanding and capabilities that are needed by the people using it. We think there's a lot of value in tapping into this knowledge, which has been developed over many years and which continues to be expanded as we learn more about how nonviolent struggle works and how we can make it work better so we can be more effective in our struggles for freedom and democracy and human rights. This is also a more recent book. It's Sharp's Dictionary of Power and Struggle. We think terminology in the field is extremely important. We look at this as a very precise technique that requires vocabulary so that we can understand it and communicate about it. So around the world, there is a growing use of nonviolent action. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is that the research is revealing a dangerous trend, right? And that's that the effectiveness of nonviolent action as a tool for social and political change is declining, right? So we should be very concerned about this trend, which means that even though more people are using nonviolent action, they're actually less often achieving concrete victories. And there are a few reasons why researchers say this is happening. And one is that social media and technology, are creating a complicated effect on movements. And the second is that opponents are learning and adapting, and they're getting better at undermining movements for change. These are some graphs from a research study by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan, two important researchers in the field. So we're seeing, that nonviolent action has been historically twice as likely to produce success than violent campaigns. But that more recently, we're seeing a decline, not just in nonviolent action, but also in violent action. We need to be clear about that. So what does all this mean for movements? It means that instead of being demobilized and discouraged by these new challenges, we also must adapt and prepare better and plan to be even smarter and more organized about how we act so that we can raise our chances of being successful in our struggles. My goal today for the time that we have together is to offer some insights and lessons we've gained from decades of studying nonviolent action and how it's been used by people around the world. I'm not a specialist on Myanmar. In fact, we've been, of course, watching developments there with great concern and interest, but my knowledge is not deep. And so mostly what I'm going to be focusing on is really the historical use, some of the lessons we've gained. And then the hope is that this will offer you, a way to think about the situation in Myanmar. For many of the people we work with, one of the main things we hear early on in our conversations is that their situation is unique, completely unique. And, of course, situations are unique. Context in which these ideas are being applied is extremely important. But it's also true that there's a lot we can learn from studying the historical cases and the ones that are taking place around the world today, in order to sort of distill some best practices, and that we think that applying these best practices, these basic principles, can reduce the costs of taking this type of action, costs that are often very high for people around the world, as this group knows well. It's the same learning that the opponents are doing for their own political survival. They're learning new ways to undermine movements. They're figuring out, their own weaknesses. What is it that makes them vulnerable? And then they're taking active steps to reduce those weaknesses, to address them. And so on the part of movements, they need to do the same kind of learning and adaptation so that they can be, both brave, but also, strategic. Otherwise, they're not going to be a match against opponents with massive resources and the capacity to employ extreme violence against them. So this idea that we can learn from history of how people have used this type of action in the past in order to make future struggles more effective, this is the basis of the work of the scholar Gene Sharp, who was my mentor at the Albert Einstein Institution. I worked with him as Julia said, for more than 15 years until he died in 2018. And Gene Sharp is the founder of this field called strategic nonviolent action, which is also known by other terms like civil resistance, like people-powered action. And Gene Sharp wrote dozens of books, on how people can really build power in their communities so that they can effectively fight oppressive opponents and win freedoms from dictatorships, from occupations, against invasions, how they can defeat coups and other illegal takeover of government, and how they can expand the rights of workers, of women, of minority and ethnic groups, among other political problems and conflicts. This is Gene Sharp, our mentor and the founder of our field. And just for clarity, I want to really define what we're talking about here when we talk about nonviolent struggle, because the term, as you may know, carries a lot of misconceptions and different ideas about what it is and what it isn't. And I think part of the problem is if we have so many different diverse views about a topic that multitudes of people are trying to understand and apply in a particular context, this is a problem, right? So we think clarifying language, clarifying terminology is extremely important. So the way we define it is that nonviolent struggle is a type of action taken by groups that uses social, political, economic methods rather than violent ones to struggle for diverse social and political goals, right? These goals could be to undermine or challenge a system or a policy, but it could also be to defend one. Because I think some of the misconception around how this type of action is used is that it's simply about tearing down systems, to attack systems, to undermine them, to defeat a dictatorship. But equally important is that it's really about empowering a population to also defend policies, defend systems, defend democratic values and norms when they're under attack. Because increasingly around the world today, we're seeing that, there can be a degradation of democracy. Democracy is a condition. Once you achieve it in society, doesn't mean that it's there forever. We have many different examples around the world where we're seeing attacks on the democratic institutions and norms that are, making what people fought for very vulnerable if there's not a capacity in society to defend that. So it's really important to understand this defense aspect of nonviolent struggle. People hear the word nonviolent struggle, you might be familiar with this phenomenon. When you hear nonviolent struggle, they sometimes get stuck on the word nonviolent, but what we're talking about here is not a rejection of violence alone, right? It's about what you do instead. So nonviolent action is not pacifism, it's not inaction, it doesn't depend on a specific religion or a belief system. It doesn't depend on an unrealistic view of the world. It doesn't depend on the world that, we wish we had, but in the world as it is, a complicated place where people can be wonderful and cooperative and kind, but where they're also sometimes unresponsive to suffering or even capable of great brutality. So it doesn't depend on humans being fundamentally good, right? That's a separate conversation. But it does depend on a type of human behavior that fortunately comes very naturally to all of us. And that is, basic human stubbornness. It's this capacity to disobey, to disrupt, to refuse to cooperate with injustice, even when doing that carries a heavy price. This is something that comes very naturally to all of us. There's no debate about whether humans have a capacity for stubbornness. In fact, we're born with this quality. Even animals have it. So this idea comes from, that this type of action, nonviolent action, comes from an idea that sometimes conflicts can't be solved by negotiation or compromise alone, right? These are issues, These are cases where there's fundamental issues at stake. People's fundamental beliefs, people's fundamental way of life is at stake. These are issues on which people don't think that they can abandon their beliefs and demands. And also where conventional and traditional means like lobbying, like negotiation, are either not available or they're not desirable. And they're not desirable because they're not likely to produce an acceptable and just outcome, because negotiations depend on a lot of things, and so if there's a great power imbalance, then it's not likely that any kind of negotiated settlement is going to produce a outcome that people in society that's going to make people happy, especially on fundamental issues, when fundamental issues are at stake. So in nonviolent action, people refuse to do some things, things that are required by law or by custom, and they do other things that are forbidden, right? And if they can do that in large numbers in a disciplined way, and even when they're met with repression, this type of action becomes a powerful tool for waging conflict. A tool that doesn't depend on the destructiveness of war and violence. So Gene Sharp's work goes back to the 1950s, when he began his research on Gandhi. And he really started as a Gandhi scholar, but as he did his research, he quickly came to a conclusion, an early realization, which at the time was quite revolutionary, which was that what Gandhi did in South Africa, and then later in India in the 1920s and the 1930s, it was remarkable and very special, but it wasn't completely unique. And he learned that there's actually a rich history where people have chosen to use nonviolent action to conduct their struggles, and this history goes back even to ancient times. And in fact, one of the earliest recorded cases, which for a long time Gene Sharp said was, the earliest recorded case, was in 495 BC, and it's called the plebeian withdrawal of Rome. You may wonder why I'm talking about ancient history. Well, I think it's important to understand that no one society invented this. Even Gandhi, who we associate so closely with this, didn't come up with this. He learned from other struggles that have taken place throughout history. He said during the Indian independence movement, we must use the Russian method against tyranny. He's talking about the general strike. So this is something very human to all of us. And I think when we're thinking about using it in our societies, we have to understand we all have a history of this, and that history is something really important, that we can claim this as our own, not a Western import, not an Eastern import, something that is very basic and human to all of us. So back to this early struggle called the plebeian withdrawal of Rome. And so this is when the workers of Rome, these were the people who did all the administrative, the financial, the service, all these jobs, right? They allowed Rome to function, right? They produced all the food, they ran all the shops, but they were tired of being denied social and political rights. So they left the city and they settled on a mountain, and they threatened to start their own town. And they did this to send a message to the rulers of Rome. They said, you need us for your society to function. And until we get better political rights, we're going to stay right here and see how well you do without us. And so in this way, they won a lot of rights and freedoms. And for a long time, as I mentioned, this was considered to be one of the oldest recorded cases. But we learned not long ago that actually there was an earlier labor strike. One of the earliest sort of general strikes in history was in Egypt in 1170 BC, so almost 700 years earlier than the plebeian withdrawal of Rome. So artists who were building a burial chamber of Ramses III went on strike because their rations, they did their work, and in return they got a certain amount of grain. So the grain was late, and it was late because of corruption in the ruling classes. So just as nonviolent action has ancient roots and is nothing new, so also is government corruption. So the workers complained to the government, but they were ignored, as often happens with these type of struggles. So they put down their tools and they walked out of this burial chamber they were building, and they refused to work. And they were eventually successful. And they realized this tactic was effective. It was an effective way of getting, what they wanted. So they continued to use it throughout the whole reign of Ramses III. And this is a very important, point as well, where people who have success using nonviolent action understand that it offers them a advantage, that it's a way to level the playing field with powerful opponents, that it's a way to use the leverage of the numbers that they have in order to, force concessions. And this is something we have to remember, that when we talk about how nonviolent action works, this isn't about making the opponent see the justness of your cause. This is really about applying the pressure that makes it so they have to grant demands. And that if the movement can sustain those demands, can make those demands, even when they're met with repression, then this is where you see the power of nonviolent action. So since this plebeian withdrawal of Rome and the ancient case in Egypt, nonviolent action has been used for multitudes of struggles against dictatorships, to resist invasions and occupations, to defend against coups, and in struggles for human rights, women's rights, the rights of workers and minorities, and in recent years in environmental campaigns. People are very interested now in exploring how does a technique that was used in one context, how does it apply in a different context? For example, we saw that it has historically been used to fight occupation or invasion. So then the question is, how do you fight internal degradation of democracy or an internal attack on democracy? These are very, very important questions. They're also wondering, how does an anti-authoritarian type of struggle, or these principles that have been mainly applied in this anti-authoritarian context, how does that apply to the climate, defense of climate movement, climate justice? And so part of what we do at the Einstein Institution is to really look at how do these principles apply in new contexts, so we can share that information with people who are exploring the use of this type of action for all of the diverse multitudes of conflicts that exist in our world today. So as I said, we have dozens of books on this topic. Most of what we've done is to create research and then share the results of that research through publications, often in translated form. We have a number of publications that are in Burmese, as well as ethnic languages of Burma, that were produced even back in the late 80s. And those are available on our website at aeinstein.org. I can share that information later on. So the main way in which the ideas were disseminated is through written material. And so some of these are very short books, like a book we have, From Dictatorship to Democracy, which has been very important. And it was actually written at the request of activists in Myanmar in the late 80s. And it was finally published in 1993 and made available in both Myanmar as well as in Thailand, and then later on in many different countries. One of our most popular books. But in terms of our resources, this is one of our most popular resources. So it's this, one-page list of methods of nonviolent action. And this is a list of the types of action that people have historically taken as part of this framework of nonviolent action. But what's interesting is it's actually divided into categories depending on, groups of methods that kind of maybe are similar, or they operate in similar ways. So part of it is about what is the intended outcome or impact of a specific type of action. So we have three categories, and the first is the methods of nonviolent protest and persuasion, right? These are methods that communicate dissent. they communicate that X number of people either agree with something or disagree with something. These are the methods that are most often either associated with nonviolent action or sometimes even equated with it. People think nonviolent action is simply about communicating an expression of an idea. Perhaps not this group that is more sophisticated in its use of nonviolent action, but around the world, many people think that really these methods of protest and persuasion, which are demonstrations, which are marches, which are vigils, these are when groups of people concentrate outdoors in public, perhaps to communicate a particular value. But these methods also include the methods of non-cooperation, which in Myanmar's case, you might be more familiar with as well. These are things like labor strikes, like economic boycotts, like political non-cooperation. This is where you actually refuse to cooperate or provide obedience or assistance to a political system in order to weaken it. And also you have the methods of intervention. This is where, you develop new systems for leadership, right? It's the building of alternative power. And these are extremely important methods. They're often very difficult to do, but they're also very disruptive and incredibly powerful. So the idea is not that you do this list of methods in any particular order, but that this really is a sort of repertoire, a toolbox of methods available so that you could think about what makes sense in a particular context, but that you can't just use methods from one category, that just as methods of non-cooperation in which you withdraw cooperation from a system are important, so also is the methods of intervention, which is where power is built. I have the sun coming in. It's just been very cloudy all morning, and now it's decided to come out. So pardon I'll just shift a little bit, excuse me. Hope that's not distracting. So people get very excited about this list, because so much of our work is heavily theoretical, and this list is very tangible, right? It's very specific things that people can do, and it's also eye-opening. As we said, for people who sometimes think that the most you can do is go in the street with a sign, the idea that there's this whole kind of diverse toolbox is very exciting for people. What's also important to share is that this list was first published in 1973. So we're talking about nearly 50 years old, and many of these methods were collected going back to the 1950s. I have to ask just for one moment that I close my blind. Please excuse me for 1 second. Okay, sorry about that disruption. We're talking about this list and really how eye-opening it is for people. And as I said, part of it is that there's this diverse toolbox. It's also important to say that this is just the beginning, that new methods are being invented all the time. This list is being expanded. People are discovering new methods. And many of the new methods are being discovered as people figure out how to use, technology and social media as new means of, communication, as new means of organizing. And so the expansion of the methods, right, is being fueled by technology, but more importantly, it's being fueled by human imagination and creativity. And so for that reason, there's lots of, additions to this list, with expanded methods being included. And so the experimentation that we're seeing around the world is very encouraging, and it's inspiring, especially by young people. But we're now involved in a project to look at how, how young people are really at the forefront of leading movements for change around the world, and have also been historically. And so we're trying to figure out, how do you create tools specifically for young people, and especially to reflect the increasingly decentralized nature of movements. So as we said, this field is being guided by scholarship in universities and different academic programs that are trying to improve this technique, figure out how it works and how that information can be shared with people. But most of the innovation is happening in the field. A lot of new methods are being invented, and also people are trying to incorporate, and this is not anything new, but much of it we're studying for the first time, about how to use art and culture and music and poetry to convey ideas, but also to unify people. And I just want to give one example of that. These are just some examples of the methods of protest and persuasion. We said the methods of social, economic, and political non-cooperation. We also have the methods of nonviolent intervention that are the disruptive methods. And back to the methods. So I was talking about, really the use of music and culture, and I wanted to just bring your attention to this protest song by an Iranian singer named Shervin Hajipur. And the name of the song is Baraye, and that means because of or for. So each line of the song is taken from a tweet that expresses what people are fighting for or what they're fighting against, right? So the song has received, just in the first couple of days, it received 40 million views after it was released. And it really, terrified the regime, because they arrested this musician and they charged him with inciting violence. So as you can see, this is almost a crowdsourced protest song. And it's really, really profound, and has been very, very important in terms of its unifying, the way that it's unified people in Iran, which, as you may know, is in its 100th day of an uprising where people are demanding equal rights and also a change in the regime. And I know music has also been an important way in which people in Myanmar have historically, and also in recent years and months, have continued to express defiance and communicate to their opponents, but also to each other and to the outside world, that the struggle against the coup continues. So people around the world are using incredible creativity and, music and culture to come up with new ways to disrupt and to defy unjust authorities. But the real power of these methods comes from, of course, figuring out how individual methods work, but also how action can be coordinated, right? So not how methods works individually, but also how do they work together in a particular struggle. And this is where I think we're running into a lot of challenges globally, as we're seeing that, the social media is fueling very decentralized movements, but then, people need to have information and knowledge to design action in a decentralized way that can be effective. So we need to understand for our movements how to make action so it's not isolated expressions of defiance and bravery, but that the actions can build on each other, right? So they can plug into a wider national or a transnational strategy. And this is the tough work of movement building, right? Of strategic planning, which is really where nonviolent action becomes a powerful tool when it's conducted in accordance with strategic principles. And strategic planning, as we define it, is really developing a plan for, what to do, how to do it, and when to do it in a way that can maximize the chances of achieving a particular goal, right? And of course, very importantly, because movements can do all the planning that they want, but a very, very important important element of planning is to plan for how to withstand repression from opponents that we know will do whatever that they can get away with in order to undermine and defeat movements. So carrying out struggles is effectively is complex, right? There's no kind of formula to follow. And Dr. Martin Luther King said that unfortunately, there's no kind of neat row of buttons that we can push, to produce the outcomes that we want in our societies. So how do we think about strategic planning in today's world? As I said, it's very important to consider, as movements are increasingly decentralized, as they're fueled by social media and other, technological tools that are very good at recruiting people, right? They're very good at expressing a crisis or in a crisis moment, getting people to understand that they need to act, getting to understand that getting people to understand that there is a crisis, right? These tools are very effective in doing that and getting people to understand quickly that there's a problem, but then the question is, how do you take effective action? How do you act in a way that can actually address the problem? Because many of the problems in our society are not problems of information. We often have access to information about the nature of the problem, but then the issue becomes, what do you do about it? And so social media and technology don't necessarily tell you what to do. And I think in the absence of a sort of centralized leadership, because many of these movements, I mean, when you look at Iran today, Iran has a long history of nonviolent action. And, going back to the revolution against the previous government, against the monarchy, which actually produced this current government, in 1979, since then, that revolution itself was nonviolent. And since then, they've had a series of uprisings in which citizens basically, organized and demonstrated and used a whole repertoire of different nonviolent action to demand change. And what we see today with this current uprising is that it was in response to an act of police brutality. But the police brutality by the security forces, in which, a young woman was killed, that really sparked this movement, that was nothing new. The police have been harming people for a long time, but something different happened that really sparked this uprising. And then the question was, how can it become sustainable? Because acts of momentary, recruitment and mass mobilization are important, but they need to be sustainable. And we need to figure out, how do you make sure that people understand what the movement is about, what its long-term goal is, but also what are the component shorter-term campaigns that can bring them closer to a long-term objective. This really requires analysis. It requires understanding of these tools, understanding of how nonviolent action works, how it can work against, in a context of extreme repression, where there's a major capacity and a willingness to use violence to defeat these movements. This requires more than just, calling for protests on Facebook, for example. There's a lot of strategic planning involved. So this is where, we're trying to create better tools and better understanding to really reflect the nature of decentralized leadership and movements today. We talked earlier about this decline in effectiveness of movements, right? And we talked about Iran. There's also other large uprisings in recent years, like in the Arab Spring, but also in Belarus, excuse me, in Iran, in Myanmar, in Sudan, and so part of the problem is that these movements are not achieving a lot, at least in the short term. So we said that part of the reason for the decline is that opponents are more sophisticated than ever, right? They're using new methods and smarter repression in order to fight activists, right? They're studying these tools. They're trying to understand nonviolent action better, because for their own political survival, they want to be able to withstand these types of movements when they're targeting them. That's, pretty obvious. And they're also cooperating with each other. This is where we also need to cooperate with movements in other parts of the world, in our own regions, in order to understand better, against opponents who are cooperating, who are sharing resources, who are sharing tools. The same level of cooperation needs to happen among movements so that there can be a sharing of knowledge, inspiration, and information. So the complicated nature of social media and its effect on movements is, again, that it's mobilizing people too quickly. And this seems, maybe 10 years ago or more, it was considered to be very exciting for people. This idea that, social media is reducing the cost of organizing. It's reducing the cost of bringing people into the streets. Because if 20 years ago or 30 years ago or 50 years ago, the amount of work required to bring people out into the streets in the kind of numbers we're seeing in the world today, well, it was very costly, right? But skipping those steps, we've learned, has actually made it so movements are less sustainable, because the institutions and the strengthening and the capacity building and the training that went into creating large numbers in the street is precisely what also made movements much stronger and more sustainable. And so if movements are able to do this type of recruitment and mass mobilization without, all of the institution building, the power building, then they are left feeling, they're left vulnerable. So again, I think, how do we create this capacity among decentralized movements? And I think a lot of it is really, how do we, increase capacity that's technical, that's training capacity, that's financial capacity, in ways that can educate and support what people are already doing. So how do we provide the educational kind of capacity that is meant to replace what usually a leader was, guiding the movement to do? So in the absence of that, how do people figure out for themselves in their communities ways to act effectively in accordance with strategy, but also in accordance with what's the national vision? So we call this, and the idea here is to help people design action that's more effective, also to help them coordinate a bit better, and to figure out things like why to avoid being provoked into violence, why violence is counterproductive, how do you tactically avoid it, how do you make sure the movement doesn't use it, or that if it does, if parts of the movement are using violence, that we, make sure that it doesn't derail the movement into a violent uprising or into a civil war. These are really, really important educational components that a movement needs to pay attention to. We also think that we need to pay better attention to mental health and the importance of tools for activists that can, give them capacities in the mental health dimension, that can understand that people are not just activists or political actors, they're also human beings with personal needs, with spiritual needs. And I think that, we need to make sure that those tools are also incorporated into, this toolbox, that are also incorporated into trainings, that people have an opportunity to talk about that, to share those things, because, when action gets risky and difficult, as it does with this type of action, people need resources that can help make what they're doing sustainable. And often those are these types of mental health tools that address feelings of, powerlessness and despair. So all of these kind of tools or resources or kind of capacities that need to exist, we call this a sort of civil resistance muscle, right? This is a type of understanding that we want to make sure exists in society, in our communities, We want to make sure it's as broadly available as possible, that's available in different formats. So it's not available just to people with university degrees, but who also are members of our community that have important roles to play. And so information needs to be in different forms, in different formats. You know, I heard that many years ago, there was even like a comic book made and for Myanmar, in which ideas of non-cooperation were communicated through visual elements. And this is important, obviously, for societies in which, you know, there's basic literacy is lacking. And so we need to be more imaginative about who we're creating resources for in order to really exercise this civil resistance muscle. So the idea is, how do you make this knowledge as widely available as possible so that people are able to design effective action that's in line with the national goal? I just want to be really clear about that, because we're just understanding in recent years how important that is. I want to check on the time and make sure I'm not running over. It looks like I've taken up a lot of my time. I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and maybe someone could just remind me in the chat how much time I have left for this portion, because I'm very interested also to hear from you all about how these ideas relate to the situation in Myanmar. And so I would be very interested in opening it up to discussion. But before I do that, I just want to talk about maybe some basic strategic principles, you know, that can help us plan effective action. And very important, you know, because as I was thinking about what to share with you today, you know, the question was, you know, this topic is complex. Nonviolent resistance, in terms of the way it operates and, you know, the theory is complex. You can get that information from books. I really wanted to think about, you know, what is it? What are the basic principles that are really fundamental to this when we talk about nonviolent struggle? And we always want to emphasize the importance of understanding political power. So I just want to go through a couple of kind of basic elements of nonviolent action, you know, share with you what we think is really essential about this. I'll try to be just, you know, a few minutes, hopefully just 10 minutes or so, and then maybe we can, you know, use the remaining time, just maybe 10 to 15 minutes, the remaining, you know, 20 minutes to for discussion. So first, we want to shift how we think about political power, you know, what it is, you know, what is even political power, and where it comes from in our society, you know, because in most of our societies, you know, whether the most authoritarian or the most democratic, we're usually attributing more power to our political systems than they actually have, right? So in this way, we're giving up power. We're seeing them more powerful than they actually are. But actually, our view of political power, on which this technique is really based, is that actually, you know, power is not monolithic. You know, this traditional view of power, that it's a sort of pyramid, power resides at the top, we're just kind of powerless subjects that do whatever the system says. This isn't really reflective of society, any society. In fact, systems of power, political systems, they rely on multitudes of people and groups to help them carry out their policies, right? So this means that the population, you know, through different institutions, through different groups, through different networks, through religious groups, through the family system, through NGOs, you know, through just a whole variety of both established organizations and also the informal networks. These all hold a great deal of power because they are organized networks that could together deny obedience, cooperation, and assistance to an oppressive system that is going to be weakened if this cooperation is cut off. So the goal of the movement becomes, you know, if people hold all this power, which is not necessarily activated. It's almost power potential. How does it get activated? How do we tap into it? How do we realize unrealized power? And this is really, this institution building, power building, network building kind of effort, right? Not just online, but in our communities. And these groups are essentially pockets of power. Carrying out action through these groups where people trust each other, where they have experience working together, it makes actions more powerful than operating on our own. And in countries where people are heavily fragmented, right, like in authoritarian societies where organizing is difficult, where political action is sometimes carried out through all kinds of groups. And I know this is the case in Myanmar as well. Groups like Artist Collective, like professional associations, like sports clubs, so not just traditional NGOs, as we said. We're seeing this today in Sudan. Sudan, as you may know, had a revolution in which they, got rid of their decades-long dictatorship. After that, there was a military coup. And since then, basically, the society has been working to make sure that the military dictatorship does not consolidate power. So during the initial uprising, what happened was that, they created these so-called neighborhood resistance committees. And in these committees were basically for the anti-dictatorship uprising in the early days. Were coordinating action, they were carrying out resistance activities, they were building recruitment, they were doing all of these very, very important activities that were important for resistance. But then once the coup happened, these groups shifted what they were doing, they continued what they were doing. They took it as an opportunity that once the revolution is over, is not the time to demobilize, that actually this is a dangerous period. This is when a coup could happen. And so they stayed organized. And these neighborhood committees, which were just informal groups of citizens, and many, many of them, they are the ones that are now playing an important role to make sure that, they prevent the coup government from gaining legitimacy, or international legitimacy, or consolidating political control. So the question, I think, for all of our societies is, how do we create and strengthen, these building blocks of power in our communities? Ideally, it would be before a crisis, right? To make sure that these networks exist so that when there is a crisis, that they're able to act effectively. How do you do this in the midst of a crisis? This is an important question. So effectiveness in our struggles also means that we move beyond just expressing, what we don't like about the system and the policies that are harming us, but also creating a shared vision of the society that we're seeking, the changes that we want. I think for many people, especially when they're acting in the midst of a crisis against a democratic breakdown, against a coup or invasion, occupation, or a dictatorship, they're often very good at expressing what the problem is, what the harm is. And what's more difficult is really creating a shared vision for society, one that can really unite people. Because, us, as we mentioned, just bringing attention to a problem without offering a way to act to address that problem is sometimes demobilizing, right? It actually ends up making people feel like their problems are very overwhelming, and that there's nothing that they can do to change the situation. Also very important is, what we said earlier, people are often very good at understanding what's the long-term goal, defeating a dictatorship, undermining a coup, defeating a coup, winning freedom of various kind. What's more difficult is understanding, what are the component campaigns that are, days long, weeks long, months long, that are more limited in terms of scope, that can help groups kind of move closer to an objective. This is basic element of strategic planning. So, one important example from the Indian independence movement is the Salt March, which you may have heard of. It took place in India in 1930. Gandhi's idea was that people should march to the sea to make salt. And, it sounds to us a little bit strange, but actually making salt was in defiance of a British law that made it illegal for anyone to produce salt except for the British. So, the British, when they heard Gandhi was organizing people around salt, the person in charge of India, Lord Irwin, he said, he wrote to his superiors in England and he said, the prospect of a salt march doesn't, keep me up at night. I'm not scared of it. Even Gandhi's allies were skeptical, like, what does salt have to do with winning independence from the British, But Gandhi was a brilliant strategist, and I think there's a very important lesson here. He knew it wasn't wise to ask people to take action before they were ready, before they had the strength, before they had the capacity to do it effectively, because this was dangerous. Asking people to take action that's very risky before they have the capacity, before they've received training, before they have basic understanding, before they know how to carry out that action without it shifting to violence. This is very dangerous for our movements because it means that, perhaps when they fail, it's going to send them a message that they're, as helpless as they thought that they were. So this was something Gandhi understood well. He knew that there needed to be a first step. And before people take, risky action, one was to build the confidence of people. And the second was to, really unify them. And so the march started with 80 people. It grew to 12,000 people. And they marched 386 kilometers. So it's quite a distance. They passed through towns and villages where they talked to people to explain what they were doing. So they used the march almost as a training, to pass through towns and villages and to get people to support them. Training is extremely important. And I know trainings, there's many different kinds of trainings, but trainings of the type that build capacity to take effective action, that teach people basics of how this type of action works, how they can use it effectively. This has historically been extremely important, right? Because it sends an important message, right? It builds a capacity among people. It builds a trust among people. It gets people kind of beginning to work together, to experiment with things in a more safe way than doing it perhaps in the community or in the streets. But it also sends an important message to the community. It sends an important message to the opponents that people are serious. So the Salt March was successful itself. It also was very important in the struggle for independence against the British, which the Indians did win. But I think important here is really how to pick how small actions really can play an important role in winning wider objectives. The Indians picked an issue that was important, but it was also limited, right? It was limited geographically, didn't include the whole country. It also was limited in terms of issue, but it was an issue that had very wide popular support because everyone used salt. It was also representative of the wider injustice. Why should the British be in charge of whether Indians are allowed to make salt? So it was a very important symbolic but fundamental issue. So picking issues that can unite people is such an important aspect of nonviolent action. It was also proactive, right? It communicated not just what people were against, but what were the values they were fighting for: self-reliance, independence. They didn't ask the British for salt. They just said, we want to make our own, using our own resources. And they picked an objective they could win. It was limited enough that was within the capacity to achieve, right? And I think important, especially in a context like Myanmar, where you had a powerful uprising that the world was paying attention to, that was making people feel like they could achieve something important. And then you have this going on, continuing for many months, in which people may be questioning, what was it for? I think, crafting action that builds people's confidence that this can be effective, and figuring out what are the issues that people will fight for that are more limited, that can really model the type of action that could grow in other parts of the country. These are very, very important elements for a case like Myanmar, or a case like, for example, Nicaragua, that has also had, a very, very powerful uprising that has failed in the short term, in which people have gone underground, in which people feel very defeated, in which the leaders have been arrested, in which there has been a lot of repression and violence. People are trying to figure out, how do you now create that confidence, that belief that things, that things can change, and that people could help change them? How do you do that in a context where people have faced the level of repression that they have? Very, very important. We couldn't have this talk without discussing nonviolent discipline and the importance of maintaining nonviolent disciplines among the movement supporters. We know that, it's nonviolent action is extremely important. A basic element of effectiveness is keeping nonviolent discipline. The use of violence in cases where people are facing mass repression, it might be understandable, but it's not strategic. It's very counterproductive. And you may be seeing that in the case of Myanmar as well. It has a very counterproductive role. Nonviolent struggle, it's not meant to operate together with violence. This is something, all the research shows this, that actually, when you have a nonviolent movement and you have a violent wing, it makes the nonviolent movement weaker. And it makes it weaker for a number of reasons, and in part because, as you may know, as you well understand, violence by a movement is used to justify violence against the whole movement. Also, violence, very importantly, decreases participation, because fewer people are usually willing to take part in movements once they turn violent. And in nonviolent resistance, numbers matter. Diverse participation matters. Participation by women, by children, by older folks, people from all walks of life. This is one very important element of nonviolent action. And so violence being introduced into a movement actually weakens the movement. Violence is what opponents want for a number of reasons. They're just better equipped. They have the resources, they have the capacity, they have the understanding to deal with violence. And this is why there's a long history of, opponents putting agents inside movements to provoke violence, and even to commit it in the name of the resistance, so that they can, justify their own crackdown. And so they can shift the struggle to a type of action in which they are usually superior, which is militarily, because they want to shift the struggle back to one in which they have the upper hand. So again, we are an education and training organization, so we really, really emphasize the importance of access to information. I know as a university, you do the same. This is obviously a group that understands the importance of education and research and insight that can really inform us. And this is research and insight that's not meant to sit in libraries. It's really meant to be, packaged in ways that can reach the people who need it. So I would just urge you, to think about how we can do that. And I'm very open to any ideas you have, any kind of support we can provide. I'd be very interested to hear from any of you. We're working on the creation of an educational platform that is meant to create kind of multimedia modules of varying lengths. So videos of different lengths that, could be used in different contexts, in different languages, because there's a lot to learn from global movements. We're also very interested in learning from the Myanmar case. It's one that offers the world a lot of important insight, and not just this one, but also the Saffron Revolution and the pro-democracy movement of the 80s and 90s. So these are very, very, this is very important knowledge that I think maybe you yourselves can benefit from, but also that other regions can can learn from and be inspired by. So I want to learn from all of you whose country has given the world very important examples of resistance, and so I'm just inviting you to join in those efforts. I think I've spoken more than I should have, and I think now, in the spirit of sharing knowledge, I'd love to continue the conversation and just hear any ideas or thoughts or questions you have about what we've talked about and its relevance for Myanmar. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jamila, for the great talk.